Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again this evening. This evening, we're going to look at a few things that have happened this week and that are related to larger series of events that have occurred over the last 50 years. You may have been aware, in fact, unless you lived, as it were, on the moon, you couldn't help but be aware of the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. That's been celebrated almost in every country, certainly in every media form within the United States and the English-speaking world. The British did a whole series on these things as if they were part of their program for space exploration. But in any case, it's been widely covered. The problem is that we haven't really learned very much in the last 50 years. In fact, we may have reversed the few things we did learn from the space program, and yet we're anxious to go back into space. I don't mean we personally, but it seems our government, the American government, and many other governments around the world, that we're not alone anymore in this space race effort. So what we're going to be doing today is questioning some of that and asking whether we can discover our place in space. And more specifically, asking the question, can we survive the absurdity and distraction of the new frontiers in space race that's now been launched and we're witnessing on a daily basis? It was by viewing the Earth from the moon that we gained a lot of insight about life on Earth. So no one's arguing that the space program was a waste of time. On the contrary, it was a very valuable contribution to Earth studies. Not so much to moon studies, because we sort of knew what was there, and the Russians, in fact, had beat us there with mechanical devices. The idea of landing people on the moon wasn't all that scientifically significant, and we brought back a few moon rocks, and we've learned a few things from them. But really the question is still posed, as it was then, what is our place in space? We can look back at the only blue planet in the known universe and realize that since all life depends on water, we're the only planet with life at its surface as well. That was a big revelation. But it's not really sunk into many people. A lot of people think we can go somewhere else because they've been, in effect, treated to 50 years of science fiction since the fact of landing on the moon. We should ask not only what is our place in space, we know it's on Earth, but what should it be? What should it be in the future? Is it confined to Earth? Well, that's the kind of thing other people are starting to assert. No, we've got to go elsewhere. Well, we managed to get to the moon and put some of our gadgets on it, walk around it for a few days, and not even a few days, a few hours on a few different days, and drive a sort of buggy, what we called the moon buggy at the time, over some of its what we called topsoil, but it wasn't soil at all, it was dust. It had no living matter in it, so it wasn't soil. And that was one of the big revelations of our trip there. We knew there wasn't soil, but we didn't realize quite how barren it was and how bereft of life. The question is this where we belong? Or is the blue planet where we belong? What is our place in space? Well, people like this, who are now the administrator of NASA, are arguing that the agency is looking to Mars. It wants to return to the moon, but largely in order to use the available water that's stored there in ice to fuel trips beyond it to the moon. Even PBS, which is often referred to as the Petroleum Broadcasting System for that reason, it's such a booster of petroleum usage and go hung the effort to try to bust into what they call new frontiers of space, that they become the big advocates of this as well as the descriptors of it. It's pretty extraordinary when you look at it. Pence has made a statement about it recently, and they're all avoiding the question of what is our place in space. Take a look. If we look back at some of the, in effect, the broadcasts of these things, it's pretty staggering. Because although Pence says we want to go beyond the moon to Mars, he's never asked the question of what is our place in space and what should it be. Some are asserting we had fed the heart on fantasies, and the heart's grown brutal from the fair. There were, though, some people who raised important questions 50 years ago at the time of Apollo 11. On the 15th of July, 1969, this was the scene. It's actually pretty interesting when it was taken from a helicopter at the time. You can see that the Confederate flag is a big feature in some of the displays put up on cars at Cape Canaveral in Florida, and that was part of the problem. This is very much a white man's operation. Take a look.
I don't think anything in history has ever happened like this, Frank. With any group so large, we think there must be at least a million people. And for us, it's a terribly moving scene.
There are 1 million people that made their way down to the Cape to see this rocket go off. 1 million people in the immediate environment of Cape Kennedy to watch it go off from that launch complex 39A. Now may I have your attention? I'd like to take this opportunity to discuss the Apollo 11 profile that began tomorrow morning. We'll find two an airlock. This is the lunar markers. The third astronaut is astronaut B. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. Collins will remain on board the command and service module. Service communicating with the two defense nerds on the search for the moon.
Now you can see a few of the observers down there for the space program are a little bit bewildered by the busloads of people that start to show up. They show up not only to be part of the event and seeing the launch, but to make a statement about the priorities of our country going to the moon before they're attending to real crises, issues here in the United States. Now you recall that this moon launch takes place in 1969. We've witnessed in the 60s the assassination of Martin Luther King and of President Kennedy, who started this space program. Both those things have an enormous impact on different kinds of communities in America. And it shows up during the launch on the 15th of July, 1969.
At the time of the Apollo 11 launch, Ralph Abernathy led a group of protesters to the Kennedy Space Center to protest the priorities of the federal government.
Ladies and gentlemen of the press, on the eve of one of man's noblest ventures, I am profoundly moved by our nation's scientific achievements in space and by the heroism of the three men who are embarking for the moon. I have not come to Cape Kennedy merely to experience the thrill of this historic launching. I'm here to demonstrate in a symbolic way the tragic and inexcusable gulf between America's technological abilities and our social injustice.
Tom Paine went out to Ralph Abernathy's group and met with him. He's the new head of NASA, and they talked.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Yeah, Tom Paine is just the newly appointed head of NASA. And he realized that he could have a demonstration on his hands that would make the launch look pretty embarrassing if it took major proportions, if the press paid any attention to it. Well, it's a very small group, but his decision was to go out and meet with them. They had invited him to come and talk with them, and so he goes out and meets with them. Take a look at this. It's pretty interesting footage from the period.
He's the new head of NASA, and they talked.
ladies and gentlemen, I'm here because you invited me to be here and because I want to be here. If it were possible for us tomorrow morning to not push the button and to solve the problems to which you are concerned, believe me, we would not push the button. But the problem is that
He said, you know, this is something that we as a nation have decided that we need to do, and we think that these results are going to be positive for everybody.
we would like to see you switch your wagons to our rockets and to tell the American people that our NASA program is an indication of what this country can do.
And then he invited a select group of the people who were in the protest to attend the launch, among them Ralph Abernathy.
Encourage this country to tackle any of its other problems.
Well, that's pretty significant. He invites them to attend the launch the next morning. This is the 15th. The 16th is the day of the launch. And they applaud him and are polite enough to go. Even amidst all of these Confederate flags and the like. It's really quite extraordinary. If you look at some of the signs, though, you can see what accompanied Ralph Abernathy on the 15th. Take a look at the signs. Help. We are starving. Let us eat first and rocket later. Interesting sign. These are written by children and not very polished in their message. In fact, America, your mind is in orbit. Humanity, re-enter. Pretty direct signs and critiques of Nixon, as you'll see in the background, because Nixon was by this time the President of the United States in '69. So 50 years ago, there was a strong critique issued on the day before the launch, the 15th of July, 1969. The launch took place on the morning of the 16th of July. But he had an important message to deliver, and it wasn't an anti-moon launch message. On the contrary, it was an inclusive message that asked the astronauts to do something. Take a look.
He said, you know, this is something that we as a nation have decided that we need to do, and we think that these results are going to be positive for everybody.
We would like to see you switch your wagons to our rockets and to tell the American people that our NASA program is an indication of what this country can do.
And then he invited a select group of the people who were in the protest to attend the launch, among them Ralph Abernathy.
Encourage this country to tackle any of its other problems. As our brave, courageous heroes make their way to the moon on tomorrow, may they never forget their suffering brothers and sisters down here on the earth. May they think about us tomorrow and pray for us as we will be praying for them.
Okay, may they think about us as we will be praying for them. Well, the warnings are even more stark nowadays. Climate change And a group called Extinction Rebellion has focused this kind of thing. Climate change has meant that life on Earth for human civilization is starkly challenged and may in fact disappear if we go beyond points and limits on the Earth's surface. Already, instead of a few people with signs at Cape Kennedy saying we are starving, now there are 20 million people in Africa alone that are the victims of 4 man-made famines. Even in developed countries, warnings abound. In Britain, they came up with a recent, very staggering study, food system overhaul needed to avoid catastrophic climate breakdown. Well, this has been warned about for years from places like Oxford, because one of the things we learned about the moon was that there was no soil, and we can only live with topsoil. Take a look. Just take the case of agriculture. Humans don't produce food. We can't produce food. The best you and I can do if we go out in the sunlight is get a suntan. And if we stay out there too long, we'll get sunstroke. But we don't photosynthesize. We depend on other organisms that do photosynthesize, right? There's a ratio between the green leaf and the human population. As I say, anybody who thinks that humans can infinitely expand has no idea about how an ecosystem functions. In an ecosystem, all you can do, your best role as a human species, is to learn how to favor the environment for plants to grow. In other words, you can produce topsoil, topsoil produces food. And if you're lucky, you can get enough of that back to you to keep going. But if you're not producing topsoil, if in fact you're doing what every country, in every continent, in every culture is doing at this point, destroying topsoil, you're on the wrong side of the evolutionary trip here. And your journey won't be long. No, your journey won't be long. And in fact, it won't be on other places at all, despite your wishful thinking. Take a look.
December 14th, 1972. The final Apollo mission prepares to return to Earth.
As I take man's last step from the surface for some time to come, but we believe not too long into the future. I believe America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow.
As the last man ever to walk on the moon leaves, Gene Cernan dreams of a future when people will return.
We leave as we came, and God willing as we shall return. With peace and hope for all mankind.
But that hope fails to materialize. Years become decades, and there is no return. Now, 50 years later, that may be about to change. Humanity has its sights set on the lunar surface once more. In January 2019, China's Chang'e 4 mission becomes the first spacecraft to soft land on the moon's far side. And a few months later, Israel attempts to become the 4th nation to soft land a robotic probe on the moon.
The idea that a small country could land on the surface of the moon is a very audacious goal.
And missions to return people to the moon are also taking shape.
NASA has a plan to build something called the Lunar Gateway, which will orbit the moon as a spacecraft and allow astronauts to shuttle back up and down from the surface.
There's a real sense of hope in the community that we are within 10 years of putting people back there.
But why go back now? What's changed since the end of the Cold War moon race?
Good question. What's changed? Well, a lot of things have changed. And among other things, large numbers of billionaires have started to emerge on the world scene, and they want to start investing in space. Silicon Valley, the billionaire space race. It's staggering. Take a look.
Recent discoveries suggest there's much more to the moon than meets the eye.
There are large metal deposits, large amounts of titanium and iron. Space resources will be the next great economic revolution for humankind.
Such resources on the moon could kickstart a new space economy.
Now is the private sector. They want to see if they have a valid business case of economic activity that can happen on the moon.
But with this new economic interest come new questions.
Is it even possible to exploit resources without ownership rights?
Without ownership rights. Okay, who's going to own the moon? Well, this is absolutely absurd. Of course, the Indians have just launched today another moon session. They hope it'll land, in fact, up on the moon in September. And China is intending to launch one to Mars to bring back soil samples. Will China save the planet learning about soil samples from Mars? I doubt it, and the reason is pretty obvious. All of that logic is trying to fuel infinite growth on a finite planet, and that won't work, can't work. There is no known human society that has ever persisted in dominating its own ecosystem. What's it done before? It's hive off to colonize others. And we even have a physicist suggesting we should hive off to colonize somewhere in space. This is where Columbus, in a sense, introduced the biggest misplaced metaphor in history. He got to the New World, let's call it that, and Magellan after him, shortly thereafter, and went around the whole shooting match, and pretty much proved that it's round. But Columbus and everyone who came after him unleashed the biggest chapter in linear thinking in human history, the frontier. Endless frontiers, move out into space in a linear inclined plane. This is progress. This is out there to conquer. Of course, we disregarded the populations that lived on the other side of the frontier. They didn't count. White settler frontierism is at the core of the colonial mistake. And unless we can transcend that form of linear thinking, and I don't think it's going to be easy. I mean, in the United States, even our greatest cultural heroes like John Kennedy elected his constituency to mobilize them on the basis of frontiers of space. Well, there's nothing more absurd than the idea of frontiers off of a sphere, right? How are you going to draw it? It's a linear metaphor off of a sphere. Can't happen, won't happen. Can't happen, won't happen, but there are a lot of people trying to make it happen. We're trying to launch moonwalks and Mars landings from a burning planet. We're trying to keep alive the myth of perpetual frontier expansion, when in fact we should be looking at the science of human survival on the largest known spaceship that supports life, any form of life, in the known universe. We already live on the largest spaceship supporting life in the known universe. What absurdity it is to try to think we can go elsewhere. We can only live, in fact, in space environments to the extent that we mimic the life support systems available to us on Earth. And we think we can do a better job of mimicking life support systems than those that evolved over 4.3 billion years on the only blue planet in the known universe? What arrogance! The idea of launching moonwalks and Mars landings from a burning planet is absolutely suicidal. And we're witnessing it on all fronts. But we need a different kind of understanding. In effect, a new kind of citizen science alliance emerging around the world to work together to devise a just transition to a sustainable future on the largest inhabitable spaceship in the known universe. Earth itself.